Okay, so let's jump right in. Everyone's been talking about this absolutely massive weather event
Yeah.
that just tore across a huge swath of the U.S. on Monday, the 17th of March, 2025.
Yeah.
I mean, it was being called a monster storm, and for good reason. Uh,
Yeah. A monster storm.
it wasn't just one kind of bad weather. It was like everything at once, violent tornadoes, dust storms that were just choking, and,
Yeah.
and then wildfires breaking out everywhere.
It's really, it's that combination, right? The scale of it and then the variety of these extreme conditions,
Yeah.
and all happening at the same time. That's what makes this so unusual.
Right, and it wasn't like a surprise storm that just popped up out of nowhere. I mean, forecasters had actually issued a high-risk designation beforehand,
Right.
which is not something they do very often, and that was a signal that, things could get really, really bad, and they did. When you think about it,
Wow.
over 100 million people were in that affected area.
Yeah.
It's a staggering number, and tragically, we're already seeing the initial reports confirming, our worst fears, at least 40 lives lost across 6 states:
Uh,
Kansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Alabama. And, that number alone just tells you the gravity of what we're about to, really dive into here.
and it's important to remember those are just the initial counts. So, the full impact, both in terms of human life and just the damage, the material damage, it's going to take time to really get the full picture.
Very
Even things that seem unconnected, like the Players' Championship down in Florida had to change their schedule because of these really heavy thunderstorms. And that just shows how far this system reached.
Wow. Yeah, it really does give you a sense of just how far-reaching this was, this weather system. So where do we even begin to unpack something this vast? I guess we should start with that dust storm in Kansas. That was just horrific. What happened there that made it so deadly?
Well, what's really frightening about these dust storms is how quickly things can go from, seemingly normal to life-threatening. You're driving along and suddenly you can't see anything.
Mhm.
On Friday, this intense dust storm swept invisibility just dropped to near zero, and it caused this chain reaction pileup involving over 55 vehicles.
Oh my gosh.
Reports are saying at least 8 people died in that one event, and many more were injured.
It's hard to even imagine just driving along and then suddenly being surrounded by that wall of dust.
Right, and that's the danger with these storms.
Yeah.
You can be driving and then, boom, suddenly you're in a complete whiteout situation.
It makes you realize how vulnerable we all are, even in something as routine as, just driving down the highway.
Absolutely.
Okay, so from the dust storms in the plains, let's shift over to the southeast Mississippi. Mississippi got hit really hard by tornadoes. What can you tell us about the impact there?
Yeah, the tornadoes in Mississippi were unfortunately widespread and deadly. There are reports of 6 deaths across 3 counties directly caused by the tornadoes. Governor Tate Reeves has been providing updates, and the numbers are pretty grim. At least 27 injuries and about 217 people have been displaced from their homes.
Wow.
And beyond, the immediate human impact, there's the damage to infrastructure. At one point, 36,000 customers were without power.
Oh, wow.
Thankfully, as we talked about earlier with Florida, the crews have been working hard, and by Sunday evening, that number was way down.
It's some comfort that the power was restored quickly for at least some folks. But the displacement and the injuries, that really speaks to the just brutal force of these tornadoes. Now, Missouri, it seems like they really bore the brunt of this event. They had the highest number of fatalities. Why was the situation there so particularly bad?
Missouri saw a lot of tornado activity, sadly resulting in at least 12 reported deaths because of these scattered overnight twisters. What really gives you a sense of the devastation are the firsthand accounts. I mean, Coroner Jim Akers in Butler County described a home hit by a tornado. He said it was unrecognizable as a home, just a debris field. He said that the floor was upside down and they were walking on walls during the rescue.
It's just unimaginable, that kind of destruction. I mean, you just can't picture it until you hear those kinds of details. And then there's a story from Dakota Henderson in Wayne County, just heartbreaking. What did he go through?
Yeah, his story really highlights the personal tragedies that are woven into these big events. He was right there in the aftermath, searching for people, rescuing people. He found 5 bodies in what was left of his aunt's house,
No, right.
tragically,
Gosh.
but they were able to rescue his aunt, pulled her out through a window in the only part of the house that was still standing. He said it was incredibly difficult, and you could just hear the shock and the grief in his voice.
It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers. But stories like that really remind you that behind every statistic, there are people whose lives have been, shattered.
Yeah.
It's good to hear that Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe, he acknowledged the amazing work of the first responders, the volunteers, the faith-based organizations that were all pitching in to help. It really speaks to, the spirit of community that comes out in these moments.
Yeah, absolutely. When things are at their worst, that's when you see the best of humanity come forward. So let's move on to the Southern Plains.
Yeah.
Oklahoma had to deal with a different but equally dangerous situation with these high winds and the wildfires that were spreading so quickly.
Right, and initially we heard about one death that might have been caused by the smoke on the roads, but it turned out that the final toll in Oklahoma was much higher, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. The medical examiners later confirmed at least 4 deaths in Oklahoma, either from the fires or the incredibly strong winds. The state was battling over 130 wildfires, imagine that, and they were forced to order evacuations in multiple communities.
Whoa.
And the wind was a major factor. The State Patrol reported several cases of tractor trailers just being flipped over by the wind.
We even heard from a truck driver who said he was driving way below the speed limit because it was so bad.
Yeah, Charles Daniel was his name, and he was worried about his truck being blown over too. That's how bad it was. And the fires themselves were just devastating. Governor Kevin Stitt reported 70,000 acres burned, 293 homes and structures destroyed. And tragically, his own farmhouse burned down too.
It's just a reminder that these disasters, they don't discriminate. They can affect anyone. Shifting over to Arkansas, they were also hit with tornadoes and severe storms. What was the situation like there?
They reported 3 deaths in Independence County, Arkansas, and across 8 counties, at least 29 people were injured by the storms. The damage was so bad that they activated the State Emergency Operations Center, which means it was a major event requiring a really coordinated response.
And what about the National Weather Service's initial assessments of the tornado damage? I mean, they were especially concerning, weren't they?
Yeah, their teams on the ground reported what they called damage consistent with EF4 tornado damage in at least 2 areas. Now, for those listening, an EF4 tornado has winds between 166 and 200 miles per hour. That kind of wind speed can completely level well-built homes and toss debris for miles. It's just incredible the power that's unleashed by these storms.
It sounds like there was pretty quick communication and support from the federal level, too.
Yeah, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders spoke with President Trump, and he offered his condolences and said that he and his administration would do everything they could to help. He also announced that he was sending in the National Guard to assist with the recovery efforts in Arkansas.
So let's turn to Texas. They experienced a different aspect of this storm system, the severe dust storms.
Right. Texas, unfortunately, reported 4 deaths related to the weather, and some of those were directly linked to car crashes that happened during a really bad dust storm. Sergeant Cindy Barkley of the Texas Department of Public Safety said it was the worst she'd ever seen, talking about the almost zero visibility and how difficult it was to even assess the multiple vehicle accidents. It's that same danger we heard about in Kansas, these sudden dust storms creating these instant hazards on the roads.
It shows how, even though we're talking about different kinds of weather, they can lead to those same, dangerous outcomes for people just going about their lives. Okay, so finally, let's look at Alabama. As the storm system moved east, they got hit with tornado activity, too.
Right. Alabama confirmed 3 deaths caused by tornadoes.
Mm.
Governor Kay Ivey reported 1 fatality in Plantersville and another in Winterboro. And there were multiple tornado warnings issued across the state on Saturday night. There were reports of a possible tornado uprooting trees and damaging a home in Elrod, and then more suspected tornado damage and injuries in Sipsey, north of Birmingham. And it really drives home the point that this entire weather system was capable of spawning severe weather in different forms over a huge geographical area.
It's a stark reminder that even as the system moved on, the threat of major damage was still there. We even heard that the people tracking the storms, the Weather Service employees in Birmingham, they had to take shelter themselves.
Right, that's a big deal. When the meteorologists at the National Weather Service have to take cover, it's serious.
So as the system continued eastward, Georgia was also getting ready for a potential impact.
Yeah, Governor Brian Kemp declared a state of emergency in Georgia, and the National Weather Service issued a tornado watch for parts of southeast Georgia.
Right, and the concerns weren't just limited to severe thunderstorms in Georgia. The forecast was also calling for heavy rain along the East Coast, which could lead to flash flooding in some areas. So, as we've seen, this was a multifaceted weather event with consequences that were felt far and wide. It really was. To help us understand the scale of all this, it's helpful to get an expert's perspective. Bill Bunting from the National Weather Service's Storm Prediction Center gave some insights into what made the system so remarkable.
He pointed out something really important for understanding why this event was so impactful. He said, while March can bring some extreme weather, it's not unusual. What was unique about this one was its sheer size and intensity. It wasn't just isolated events, it was this huge system just churning out severe weather over a massive area, and that led to those, really substantial impacts over a very large area that we've been talking about.
And what about that high risk designation that was issued? That's not something we hear very often. Can you explain what that actually means?
So the Storm Prediction Center uses this tiered system to communicate the risk of severe weather. And high risk is at the very top of that scale. Their forecast maps actually use the color magenta to show these highest risk areas. So when they issue a high risk, it means they're predicting a high probability of what they call numerous intense and long-track tornadoes, or widespread thunderstorms that can produce hurricane-force wind gusts. And both of those can cause catastrophic damage. Historically, when a high risk is issued, the chances of those severe conditions happening are really high. So it's a very serious warning.
So they don't use that designation lightly. Let's get into some of the specifics about the tornadoes. We know that a number of them touched down.
Missouri alone reported at least 5 tornadoes on that Friday, and one of those affected the St. Louis area. There was also damage to a strip mall in Rolla from a confirmed tornado. And the Storm Prediction Center also warned that even though these fast-moving storms could produce tornadoes and large hail, the most widespread threat was actually from the straight-line winds, which could reach or even exceed hurricane force with gusts up to 100 miles per hour. They also specifically said that potentially violent tornadoes were a concern for a large swath of the country from the central Gulf Coast and the Deep South all the way up into the Tennessee Valley.
And those areas under the highest threat, they were clearly identified beforehand, which hopefully gave people time to prepare as much as possible.
Yeah, the Storm Prediction Center specifically highlighted parts of Mississippi like Jackson and Hattiesburg, and Alabama cities like Birmingham and Tuscaloosa. They said those areas were at the greatest risk for severe storms and tornadoes. They also mentioned eastern Louisiana, western Georgia, central Tennessee, and even the western Florida Panhandle as areas where severe weather and tornadoes were possible. That level of detail really helps emergency responders and the public focus their preparedness efforts.
So, in addition to the immediate threats of tornadoes and severe thunderstorms, there was also the outbreak of wildfires in the southern plains, which added another layer of danger to this whole situation.
Right, the wildfires were fueled by a combination of things: warm temperatures, dry conditions, and those strong winds. And this led to evacuations in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, and New Mexico. To give you an idea of how quickly these fires can spread, there was one in Roberts County, Texas, that grew from less than a square mile to almost 33 square miles in a very short period of time before they could get it under control. And then, near Stillwater, Oklahoma, there was this extremely dangerous group of fires. They called it a complex of fires. And it forced mandatory evacuations all over, including homes, hotels, and even a Walmart.
Wow, so it sounds like it was a very dynamic and dangerous situation for everyone involved, from the residents to the firefighters battling those blazes.
It was. The thick smoke and all the dust blowing around made it really difficult for firefighting aircraft to see and do their job effectively. And then there were the impacts on infrastructure. A long stretch of Interstate 70 in western Kansas had to be shut down because of near whiteout conditions from the blowing dust. It all goes to show how interconnected these different aspects of the weather event were.
And the power outages were pretty widespread, which shows just how big of an impact this storm system had.
Yeah, the high winds and the severe weather across so many states knocked out power for more than 250,000 homes and businesses across a huge part of the country, including Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Mississippi. Getting power restored to that many people is a huge job, and it really highlights how much disruption this storm caused to everyday life for so many people.
So to wrap things up, it's clear that this monster storm system of March 17th, 2025 was a devastating event across a huge section of the United States. We saw this convergence of violent tornadoes, deadly dust storms, and massive wildfires, all leaving their mark on the affected communities. And the tragic loss of at least 40 lives really underscores the human cost of these extreme weather events.
Absolutely. The fact that the forecasters issued that rare high-risk designation shows how serious they thought it was going to be, and unfortunately their predictions were right. The fact that all these different severe weather events were happening at the same time over such a large area really makes this a historically significant event.
It does. And when you step back and look at an event of this size and intensity, it makes you think about the bigger picture. Does an event like this make you think about, how we prepare for and respond to these kinds of interconnected natural disasters? It seems like there's a lot to consider about how resilient we are in the face of a changing climate, and maybe we need to rethink our preparedness strategies both individually and as communities. Maybe a good next step would be to look into your local emergency management resources or learn more about the science behind these powerful weather patterns. It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll be back next week to discuss another current event.
See you then.
Bye.